All righty, good afternoon and welcome to everybody. I'm one of your hosts, Steve Fleck. On behalf of Chapel Hill Alliance for a Livable Town, my co-host Linda K. Brown, timekeeper Virginia Gray, and our facilitator, Julie McClintock. Today's webinar will focus on the difficulties of financing affordable housing and on some creative solutions. We have a full program, so to save time, we'll provide only a brief introduction to our participants while providing information on them on our website, where you can also find the program agenda and resource sheet for this webinar. Please place questions in the Q&A section while speakers are talking, and during discussion, we'll get to all the questions during discussion after all of our guests have spoken. You may direct your question to an individual or to all speakers. Okay, first up, joining us to explain major obstacles to financing permanently affordable housing is Peter Sabonis, Director of Human Rights for Development at Partners for Dignity and Rights. Peter?
Thank you, Stephen. Everybody hear me? Thumbs up? Great. I am going to go share my screen and lead us through a discussion of the financing challenges of permanently affordable housing with a PowerPoint. And as was noted, I'm with Partners for Dignity and Rights. You can check our website, or just simply, if you want to see the work we've done, simply Google affordable for whom, affordable for whom, and you will get a link to a page that has most of our work on it. The obstacles to financing permanently affordable housing. First of all, I just have to mention this. I think we all know this, but it's important to realize it. Housing, unlike many other financial, economic human rights, education, healthcare, etc., is a complex interaction of a number of things. We have economics, we have the social issues, we have cultural issues, and we have political. And I'm not going to open each of these, but the fact is housing really involves all of those things, which makes it rather difficult when we say, well, there's not the political will to do this. I think what we're saying there is all of this, because that's really their political dynamics, certainly. But housing really, it touches all these things. Today, we're going to focus on the financing piece of it, and just simply put, the obstacle to financing permanently affordable housing is simply one, the lack of profit in it. We tend to, in this country, look to the private market to provide most of our needs. And when we pick apart the financing, as we will do today in a rather simplistic way, there's not enough profit in affordable housing to incentivize enough developers, enough private developers to develop it. So there's assistance that's needed to incentivize it for those who are looking for profit, and also assistance even for those, it's necessary for those who are even doing it on a nonprofit basis. And so government subsidies are necessary. And simply put, again, there has been a declining supply of government subsidies. The federal government subsidies have declined over the last 2 decades. States and localities have struggled to fill that gap. And also, when we get to permanently affordable housing and subsidy retention, so to speak, most of the subsidies that are out there have affordability durational requirements. That is, keep this affordable for 15 years or keep it affordable for 30 years, and then it can go to market. So a lot of what we see out there is basically the result of the financing landscape. Now I'm going to do a bit of Housing Development 101. And this is not from, this is a simplified version of Housing Development 101, which we've tried to use this with grassroots groups to try to demystify the housing development landscape. And yeah, I hope that it works here as well. But there are really three stages of housing development. And these three stages all impact the eventual cost of housing in terms of home ownership cost, rental affordability, co-op cost, co-op housing cost, whatever. And these three stages essentially are property acquisition and pre-development, that is planning. The second stage is construction of housing, or if you're using existing housing, rehabilitation of that existing housing. And three, especially for rental housing and co-op housing, you have to think about operation costs down the road. So let's just pick apart each of these, because really getting to affordability, as I indicated, involves really keeping the costs at each stage as low as possible. So with the first stage, with property acquisition and pre-development, this really involves getting control of the property, getting some promise to get control of the property, et cetera, and then making the calculations of cost and financing for all stages of the project, all stages of the project. This is the trick in housing development. You have to present to either the government or lenders. You have to present the whole project, and this can be challenging at times. Let me see what we got here, but it can be helped in terms of property acquisition in this realm with these various strategies. I'm not going to go into each of them, but the ones I will highlight are trying to get properties from anchor or faith institutions who have excess property, acquisition of property from states and localities. There also have been a number of programs that have been developed that specialize in property acquisition, especially in very hot markets like San Francisco and New York City and Oakland. In terms of the second piece, construction and rehabilitation, this involves a mix of equity and cash. This is called a capital stack, so to speak. Equity is simply grants, contributions, cash on hand. It's money essentially with no strings attached. This could be from the government, or it could be from other friends, investors, cash on hand, whatever. And then you have debt, and you would like to minimize your debt. You'd like to have all of your housing costs be taken care of by equity, and you wouldn't have to pay any money back. But housing is pretty expensive, and you usually can't cover the whole costs. And this debt will either be hard debt, which is a loan, typical loan with a payback amount, or soft debt, which could be a flexible loan where payback might not be required. So that's the capital stack that we're dealing with in the construction rehab phase. And again, remember, you're trying to reduce costs at each of these phases. Here's a slide, and we'll be sharing the slides later, but this gets into various ways that that communities and governments have found to meet these equity and debt challenges. And again, what you're trying to do here is get the debt as low as possible, because you're going to have to pay off the debt at some point. And that affects the rents you charge. It affects the price of the housing if it's home ownership housing, or affects the co-op fees if it's co-op housing. Finally, you have, and this is in the rental housing co-op arena, is operation costs. Because here, if you're doing rental housing or co-op housing, you have to pay off your debt. You're going to have to maintain the housing. You're going to have to create reserves for emergencies. And you're going to have to cover that with the rents that you charge. And so with extremely low income housing, that is for housing when you get down below 30% AMI. There have been a number of ways to do this, or even with 50% AMI or below, or 60% AMI and below. And essentially there are three ways that we've seen that this is done in terms of assistance. One is through vouchers. The other is through programs that actually provide direct operating assistance. And the last is through the use of what I would call cross subsidies. That is, you have some units in the development that are renting at a certain high rate, others at a low rate, and you're using the higher priced units to subsidize the lower priced units. So that's essentially by recap, or my simplistic presentation on the three stages of housing development. And I think as we go forward today, what's helpful to remember is that usually when we're thinking of anything, whether it's a presentation on CDFIs, on co-ops, on a public policy, it's actually fitting in to some piece of this and trying to make things more affordable and more equitable. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I think my time is up. I have 10 minutes and 8 seconds. So I will I'll shut up and turn it over to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now we're going to look at 3 ways that communities manage to make housing more affordable. We're going to begin with Thurman Smith, PNC Bank Senior Vice President and Territory Executive for Community Development, who will explain how community development financial institutions, CDFIs, help make housing more affordable. Welcome, Thurman.
Thank you, Linda. First of all, I want to really thank Peter. That was terrific, and you really do frame how we look at this equation. So let's tell the truth first, and the truth is that smaller developers in particular, and Black and brown developers even more explicitly, tend to have more difficulty accessing capital, and that includes both debt capital and equity capital. And then affordable housing developers, as a subset of that, can also face a lot of those very same challenges. And as Peter pointed out, there is a cost to a developer in economic terms to keep a property affordable. And that is, we typically hold the rents at levels such that families that are earning 80% or less of the average median income in an area can still afford it, and at a level where it doesn't exceed 30% of their income. What that generally means is that your market rates are typically higher than the rates that we afford to low and moderate income families, who we generally characterize as our affordability group. Although, to be very clear, in many of our communities, it's equally important, in fact, I would say all of them, that we also recognize that a number of what we call working families, families that earn up to, say, 120% of the area median, also struggle. And so in response to this, a number of banks, some prompted by the Community Reinvestment Act, others because it's the right thing to do, and others still because, quite frankly, even affordable housing can be a very, very good business. We enter this space, and we can enter it directly as large banks like PNC, or by partnering with what we call community development finance institutions, or CDFIs. CDFIs essentially are lenders. Some may actually be banks and take deposits, but most are not-for-profits, and all they do is lend and provide some form of technical assistance. And CDFIs, as a general rule of thumb, get a large majority of their capital from big banks and from philanthropic sources and from governmental units that understand that mission is important. And thus, your CDFIs in the market can essentially fill a gap that many banks won't. And to be clear, banks tend to be on the more conservative end of the scale, where our CDFIs will be a bit more generous in terms of relaxing credit underwriting and other criteria. But who you go to and which CDFI really depends largely on where you are and what problem you're solving for. Today, many of our developers' number one problem is acquiring inventory, whether it's a piece of land or a underutilized or blighted piece of property, or just an existing property, one that might be, for example, at the end of its affordability period, and now is looking to exit because market rents have moved, and there's an opportunistic period through which they can fully realize the profits in that development. And you, as an affordable practitioner, you want to acquire that asset. So if you're competing to acquire inventory today, speed counts. It matters because you're oftentimes competing against cash buyers. And so CDFIs are generally in a better position to help you acquire quickly because they may not have all of the same rules and regs that constrain a bank. And those rules and regs include getting an appraisal. That could be 45 days, getting an environmental report, a phase 1 or phase 2 site assessment. That could be several more weeks. There's just a whole host of rules and regs that larger banks have to follow that take more time. CDFIs get around that. And again, banks like PNC, we committed, for example, to fund another $400 million to our CDFI partners all over our footprint, but including a number that are operating in the Carolinas. And that includes organizations you might not think of as CDFIs, like I'll throw out Latino Community Credit Union, like Self-Help Credit Union. They are also CDFIs, meaning that while they perform their general functions, they're also absolutely committed to this idea of providing flexible, affordable capital to developers, and particularly those in this space. The last thing I'd point out is that, and Peter alluded to this, the cost of capital can vary greatly. CDFIs are not what we would call predatory lenders. They have their very mission, this commitment to affordable. But they tend to be probably a little bit more expensive than a more traditional bank. And so as you grow, you'll want to look at what your banks can do. And banks like ours, for example, in addition to providing loans, we can do a number of other things, and it really will depend on your project. Peter alluded to that capital stack. You may need equity. You may need mezzanine debt. You may need debt, and you're going to go, what is mezzanine debt? Well, mezzanine means subordinate generally, that someone is willing to take a piece of debt that gets paid after the primary debt has been paid. There are organizations like PNC where we can be an equity player, we can be a mezzanine player, we can be a traditional debt player. Many of our CDFIs will provide debt. They'll provide that all-important pre-development money, land acquisition money, which generally banks like ours don't. So again, CDFIs absolutely can be your friend. You can Google CDFI in my state, or CDFI fund, FUND, and get a list of CDFIs that are not only located in the state, but also operate in the state, but may be domiciled elsewhere. And you can look at each site and figure out where they like to play: pre-dev, development, construction, term, any of those on that spectrum of lending alternatives. And on that, Linda, before I get my time notice, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Thurman. We're having a bit of a technical problem with our next speaker. So I'm going to ask Steve if he can sort of change the order of things a little bit and take us to the segment at section C, anchor institutions, and I'll do the introduction for that. Financing permanently affordable housing is a difficult task that requires partnering with local community anchor institutions, such as universities and hospitals. Hospitals across the US have begun to build affordable housing. One of the earliest was Baltimore's Bon Secours Hospital. George Klebb, Executive Director of Bon Secours Community Works, will tell us how it all began. And he will be followed immediately by excerpts from videos by the Southwest Central Durham Quality of Life Project, which partnered with Duke Hospital to create affordable housing. Welcome, Mr. Klebb.
Thank you, Linda. As Linda said, I'm with Bon Secours Community Works. We are in West Baltimore, and our mission is to enrich West Baltimore communities with programs, services, and affordable housing, and to contribute to the long-term economic and social viability of the neighborhoods we serve. We are part of Bon Secours Mercy Health, which is a 7-state and Ireland health system with 50 acute care facilities and a number of, outpatient and other kind of things going on. Here in Baltimore, we provide services in 3 basic areas: youth and family, economic development, and housing and community development. And how that plays out in terms of affordable housing for us is we have just over 800 units of affordable rental housing and service. We've been providing this actually since the late 80s, when Bon Secours Hospital redeveloped a couple of vacant school buildings in the neighborhood that we serve to provide affordable housing to very low-income seniors and disabled folks. It was through a program called, which is still in existence, actually, called the HUD 202, which provides rental subsidies along with capital. And so we did that for a few years. And then in the mid-90s, when we had put a new wing onto our hospital, we found that we weren't getting the kind of volumes that we thought we had expected by putting a new outpatient wing onto the hospital that was, we thought, responding to community health needs, meaning that we had a lot of outpatient cardiology and chronic disease services, such as programs to address diabetes. And we had really done a lot of extensive research into what the healthcare needs were at the time. But when we cut the ribbon in 1993, instead of volumes going up, the volumes actually went down. And when we explored why that was happening, it really had to do with the conditions in the neighborhood that we're serving, and a couple in particular. One was an acceleration in the population loss and ensuing vacancy in the residential housing market around the hospital, surrounding the hospital. So we had a rapid influx of vacant housing. And the second was the crack epidemic and the open air drug markets that had sprung up around our hospital. So it got to the point where in the blocks leading to the hospital, we had gone from about 20% vacancy to almost 2/3. And so what the hospital did was very quietly acquired a critical mass, which would be 31 of the 67 vacant houses that were right on the street, right on the block that the hospital is located. And then we went public in 1995, committing to develop that housing, also to redeveloping an old school that was also in the neighborhood that we had purchased from the Baltimore Archdiocese. So the first 2 commitments were to redevelop into affordable housing, do something at the side of the old school to serve the families in the new housing and the surrounding community. And the third commitment, which was really the most important one, which was not to make any more unilateral decisions and to work in partnership going forward with the community. Now, if you think about how healthcare is delivered, in particular how it was delivered in the 1980s and 1990s, this was not something that we had operationalized, so to speak, before. So we learned a lot from the community organizing, community development community, and started really developing our own community engagement model. This is before the current focus, which we welcome, on the social determinants of health. So what we've done over the last 25 to 30 years has been grounded in what we believe is a really solid community engagement model that's based on 4 pillars: asset-based, relational, collaborative, and dutiful, which for us are our ways of being, how we show up. And what that's resulted in is the housing we've been able to do today. The last thing I want to say in way of introduction is that there is a unique opportunity that a medical-based anchor has, beyond just the fact that we're an anchor in the community and employing a lot of people from all over and providing services already. And that is, we're able to draw upon the resources of a large organization in terms of pre-development funds, guaranteeing loans, leveraging the balance sheet of the larger organization. So we'll probably talk more about that in the Q&A session, but what that's resulted in today is a little, like I said earlier, a little over 800 units of affordable housing, and a lot of programs and services related to that.
Thank you, George. I think we can get back on track now. We've managed to solve our problem. And Steve is going to introduce the segment on cooperative housing.
So we now welcome Devin to take it away.
Okay, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, and very sorry Thomas and the others couldn't provide additional insights that they have in addition to what I have. I'm a board member on Weaver Cooperative Housing Association, which is a local housing association in Carrboro. We manage 2 smaller older apartment complexes, 2 properties, and have been in operation for more than a decade. Got some, and I was not here, and I was not a part of the original part of the of the funding and acquisition. I know that we got a loan from Weaver Street Cooperative, the local food cooperative, and that we have received government funding, and that we continue to get support from local and county governments in what we do in providing, and we are an affordable housing thing. I believe our cap is 60% of the area median income, and all of our residents have to requalify every year on that. If we go back to the first sort of slide that was shown, one of the things that's different about what we do is, obviously, the people who build the housing originally most likely made a profit. But when we get to that third step of ongoing operations, the housing cooperative is not operating on a profit motive. So right there, we're able to operate at less than profit-driven institutions. We also, if we break down that slide that was shown, obviously we do have to pay off loans. We actually just refinanced recently and got a reasonably good deal. When it comes to maintenance and repair, we do not hire an outside management company. We manage our own. It's resident managed. So we have maintenance coordinators at each of the cooperatives, and a lot of maintenance is done in-house by people who are earning hours that they need to contribute in addition to their financial contribution. So we cut costs by doing some of our own work. We do manage to do the other things that a responsible community does. We do pay our loans on time, and we do have reserves, as was mentioned in that slide. We put aside reserves, and we have been hiring people to do comprehensive evaluations of the properties and do long-range planning in terms of what are the maintenance tasks that need to be done. In addition to that sort of more or less obvious ways in which we keep housing affordable by eliminating profit motives and doing our own work, there are things that happen in a cooperative community which are part affordability and part quality of life. And I think what happened during the initial days of the COVID crisis is really educational, sort of shows what happened there. Right away, we met when the very first cases came to North Carolina, as lockdown orders were being contemplated, and decided that no one would be evicted from any of our units for lack of pay during the worst of the crisis. And we were able to come to consensus and use our other reserves and other financing that we had to make a difference and keep people housed and not put people on the streets during a crisis. That happened before the state put in a moratorium. The moratorium came later. Even during the moratorium, I'm aware of evictions that happen in our area, some of which happened illegally, and some of which happened in what were loopholes in the moratorium at the time, such as an owner saying that they wanted to sell the property or change or fix the property or something. We also have an ongoing process that works with people for any sort of problems that they have at the community, if there are interpersonal problems or if there are problems with paying their share. We have a process that they work with the community community works with them. They're not put in an impersonal eviction process by someone they don't know. They work with their neighbors and we work with them together. And again, what happened during COVID is a relatively good example of the difference that a co-op housing situation can make. I'm aware of landlords in the area who did not accept the available funding that was put through the home grants. The way that, I don't know if everyone in the audience is aware of that, but the way that those grants worked, they would cover rent and even back rent, but they went directly to a landlord and the landlord had to accept them, and the landlord had to accept some terms with those, such as not evicting them for a certain amount of time. And not all landlords would accept those payments or those terms. Quite the contrary to that, we distributed information, helped people fill out forms, helped people apply for funding that was available on the county and local levels through these programs, put people in touch with other nonprofits and funds that were available, and coordinated and really came together as a team, and no one was evicted during the heart of the COVID crisis. So that's just really what I want to say about life at the co-op and what it means to be affordable there. Look forward to answering questions.
In 2001, 6 neighborhoods strategically located between downtown Durham and Duke University came together and decided that they had a shared responsibility for their quality of life. They decided it would be more effective for them to work together to improve their communities. So they founded Southwest Central Durham Quality of Life Project to make it all happen. Duke called that first meeting, and it was really tense. This was not the first time this had been tried. I was hired by Duke's office.
Something's wrong with the sound. She's stopped.
And the affairs to coordinate the project. Because of my professional experience and 2 years that everyone called the Civil War years. At the end of every meeting, we took a vote. Do we want to continue? And we stayed with it. Eventually, we found common ground in 4 areas, and of these, housing was really important. We discovered quickly, though, that we couldn't make changes alone. We needed help. We turned to the Self-Help Credit Union, a nationally recognized leader in affordable housing right here in Durham, and they had already worked with Duke in the Walltown neighborhood. We came up with a plan where Duke would underwrite the purchase of the properties, and then Self-Help could help manage the redevelopment process.
Self-Help's endeavors in housing development are really based off of the fact that we believe that you build wealth through ownership. And ownership primarily comes from owning your own home and another.
Our first project together was Pauli Murray Place. 13 new houses to be built on a cul-de-sac that had been home to liquor houses and illegal gambling. It made sense to name the project for an amazing woman who grew up in the same neighborhood and became a civil rights activist, lawyer, poet, and an Episcopal priest. She was known as a visionary, and we wanted to do this project in her visionary spirit.
This community always had a group of people who were strong civic leaders and workers within the context of this community. They might not have been known all over this city. They might not have had the most prominent names or names that many of the people in this city knew about. But this community had strong civic leaders.
Bringing all of these housing developers to the table to work together in our neighborhoods was important. But the Quality of Life project was only going to be successful if residents got involved in the process and had a say in their collective future. Duke set the stage for this.
I think that the thing which has distinguished the neighborhood partnership from the beginning has been not that Duke was going in with the answers and saying, we're going to go do this. We went in saying, what do you see as your issues? How do you see yourself addressing those issues? And again, how can Duke be a partner with you in that? There was a time when I think folks said, oh, if Duke just comes in and throws money at the problem, that'll sort of solve it. That wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work within the university, and it wasn't going to work outside. Instead, it's become much more, what are the good ideas? What are the things we should be doing? What are all the resources we can capture to move forward, and then take it from there?
Absolutely wonderful. I was very scared before we moved in here because when he took me by the lot whenever we had purchased the lot, and then whenever they started building, and we had a couple of neighbors that were close to us kind of give me some grief.
And once people figured out we were the homeowners, I had no problem.
No, we were very well received with all the neighbors. I like the fact that it's forced me out of my normal comfort zone and put me into a completely different frame of reference, and I got to meet everybody and really accept people in a much more realistic way.
It's more or less a togetherness, having input and a part of what you're doing, working together to build a neighborhood.
The real win for this collaboration is actually for the people who own the homes, the people in the neighborhood. Housing is going up at an incredible rate, and it's making huge impacts on the neighborhood. There's much wider diversity of what's available for individuals in terms of affordable and decent housing.
I know years and years ago, people that couldn't afford you had to rent a house or 2-room, like I said, like we had 5 kids. Imagine 2 rooms.
The neighborhood. And from there, everything else begins. Once a family has a roof over its head and they're safe and they're comfortable and they're in decent housing and safe housing, then we can change other parts of the community. The crime goes down. People are inspired to make changes in their lifestyle once they are comfortably housed and safely housed.
I'm telling you, it's just phenomenal how when you look at Palmera's place, in a week we built 7 houses, and and the work that Land Trust, Habitats, and Self-Help have helped us all make this neighborhood really what it is now. It is just beautiful. Words can really not express how great this neighborhood is. And then we are all about affordable houses. We're about education and safety. And I must say, we have done a phenomenal job in all of those areas.
We heard residents like Hazeline Umstead, who are committed to the long-term health of our neighborhoods. They want to be able to age in place, and so one of our new projects is Maplewood Square Affordable Apartments for Seniors.
What's most important is the focus on neighborhood growth and development, working with the neighborhoods to ensure that we can increase home ownership, that we can help restore economic vitality to the neighborhoods, that we can improve the safety of the neighborhoods. I think, again, this is a wonderful example of the power of partnership. Duke University, the City of Durham, and all of our participating partners, all working together to make this a reality. And this is what the Duke-Durham Neighborhood Partnership is all about.
So maybe
I'll go ahead and answer Linda's question. I'll repeat it for you, Julie, if you didn't hear her. Linda shared that a number of banks have announced down payment assistance programs, and some more aggressively than others, and PNC is among those. And that's becoming a norm today, and they range anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000. There have been a couple of extraordinary programs that have been higher, and there are a number of I think we have to talk about all of the states and counties and cities that are using part of their ARPA monies. Those are the American Recovery Relief Program monies that are out there, and a number of cities have recognized that down payment assistance is a critical part of enabling LMI families. So the answer is yes, but you really have to go bank by bank to figure out what they're offering. There are a couple of, again, this ties in to our CDFIs. Our CDFIs, in addition to some of them like Neighborhood Housing Services, actually being a home lender, they're also a great resource for information, and they tend to track who has the best down payment assistance program at any given point in time. Also, some project development. I'm so delighted to hear our friends at Duke and others. Oftentimes, when they partner either with Habitat or others, they will size a grant to a family's affordability. And so you really have to do your research and find out what kinds of programs can be paired with what you want to do. If you're a developer, however, I caution that even bigger than the down payment assistance numbers are the kinds of dollars you can get through the Affordable Housing Program, AHP, which is a federal home loan bank program, whereby when you're developing that property, conditioned on your agreement to keep it affordable, there are sizable grants up to $750,000 in many cases for you to build a project, but again, conditioned on you keeping that affordable to the buyers. Linda, did that answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Linda?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
We've got a question, and this seems to be working now. So one of the things we often hear is we can't get bank financing of affordable housing. Is this a valid experience in the panelists' experience? Is there a pattern in the type of banks that will or will not provide financing? And this is something that all our speakers could address.
As the banker, I guess I'll.
Yes, go ahead and start. That seems to be muted. Best unmute.
I think Thurman muted himself.
I sure did. Let me get a class and mute and unmute. So I would say this, that tends to be a glittering generality rather than more explicit. Banks, as a general rule of thumb, are probably not the best at land acquisitions, and pre-development. But banks generally have a very strong practice of being practitioners in construction and term financing. And so you really have to know what that bank's particular focus is. You can look at a bank's balance sheet, and I know you don't generally pull up the bank's credit to check them out before going to ask them for money, but most large banks have less than 20% of their portfolio concentrated in real estate. It's not their basic forte, particularly for smaller developers, smaller being 2 million or less on a project. But local community banks and CDFIs do tend to be there. So I'm inclined to say that if you're looking for term and construction and term debt, banks tend to be pretty good at it, and probably your cheaper source, assuming that the credit profile of your business is suitable. When you're smaller or you less experienced, then you tend to want a humane lender like a CDFI that can come in and provide that financing. But do your homework. Make sure that that's the focus area of that lender, because you'll find that there are a number of lenders who are very narrowly focused on consumer loans or small business loans, and then some on real estate. Go to the right source and you'll reduce the likelihood of a denial.
Thank you, Thurman. Let's see what we have other speakers that would like to address that question or statement.
I can
Yeah, let's
weigh
each
in a
go.
little
Go
bit.
ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we've actually worked very closely with banks at Bon Secours. As some folks might have picked up on in my earlier remarks, all of our affordable housing development has been in the rental space. What I didn't mention is that we've, except for the HUD 202 projects that I mentioned at the beginning, which kind of got us started, since then, all of the developments we've done have been with the low-income housing tax credit. And so we have utilized bank resources, not only the construction lending and permanent financing that Thurman mentioned, but also have gotten banks to participate and help us to get the Federal Home Loan Bank grants, as well as, and this has been most important for us, as equity investors. If you're able to put together a package that provides the bank with the kind of leverage and participation that they're looking for, and some of this is motivated by CRA, but some of it's also motivated by I believe modifying or diminishing the risk involved. You can actually get some pretty significant support from banks. It's been, in our experience, it's been very much based on building longer term relationships and engaging in dialogue, even though, as Thurman said, the pre-development is not something the banks do too much of. CFIs are a lot better at that. But even though they may not be participating in the acquisition and the pre-development directly, getting the bank engaged early in the project, so that when it comes time to do the construction and permanent financing, we found has been a very good way to go about things. So it does, just because you don't have cash right away doesn't mean the bank's not going to participate.
From a cooperative perspective, in the existing co-op that I work with, WCHA, we didn't have any problem getting banks returning our calls when we're looking for financing. It's a matter of terms and interest rates and what that looks like. And we did shop around a bit, but we've found an acceptable refinance that is allowing us to do some large improvements to the housing. There are also specific places like Leaf Fund, which are cooperatives and work directly or specifically with cooperatives. Something else that I'm aware of from some decades ago, when I was actually working on a project to initiate a cooperative housing project, is that there are a network of existing cooperatives throughout the country, and they will at times help with providing equity for each other. So you can work with NASCO, for instance, the National Students of Cooperation, and I worked with them at that point when they were able to help finance a significant purchase for a housing cooperative. They have a network of cooperatives that own sort of, I'd call them legacy properties, really big housing cooperatives in towns like Madison and Ann Arbor. And the value of those property has skyrocketed since they were purchased many decades ago. And they're able to leverage that to help. And since their mission, again, is not to make a profit, but to promote housing and cooperation, it fits in with their mission to help use that capital to help spread.
Thanks very much, Devin. This is a great question, so we're spending a little time on it. Peter, do you want to comment on this?
Just to add a summary, which is it's all about the numbers. It's all about the numbers, it seems to me. And what George said about the numbers being, does it cost out? And if it looks like it works, we have not encountered banks who hesitate if it works on paper. But I think that what George pointed out is a good point. When they have used the low-income housing tax credits, and so they've used that LIHTC, as it's called, for that portion of equity. So the lenders are going to be looking at how much equity is being brought to the table, and then again, this is about, I mean, this is almost biblical, you know. It's like there's in Luke, they talk about this itinerant preacher talks about building a tower, and who does, you know, if you're going to build a tower, you figure out whether you're going to have the funds or be able to complete its cost, and that's basically. You know, with low-income affordable housing or multifamily housing, as one of these questions was about, you know, banks are going to look at 20 years out, 30 years out, so I mean, it's really, can you cost it out? And when it gets to rental and co-op, it's going to be how are you handling those operating costs? So that's all I'll say.
Thank you. So here's a short question, perhaps, but it's a great one. Can UNC, University of North Carolina, underwrite as does Duke? And the follow-up I would have is, why isn't UNC doing more? But does anyone want to address that? Doesn't fall in anyone's bailiwick, perhaps. Is there any reason that could not occur? Let's put it that way. Thurman, do you want to try that?
Sure, I can tell you, we partner with a number of universities across the country. And in fact, I'll go one step further, you know, just thinking about the Carolinas, like St. Augustine and others, North Central, Talladega, have all recognized that in addition to providing affordable housing for their student populations, many of their workforce also are low to moderate income wage earners, and they have found themselves almost by default in the affordable housing business. Many have gone, and I'll pick a really big one like the University of Chicago, found that that same workforce needed more down payment assistance. And so we have seen examples of where universities have provided their own employees substantial down payment assistance grants. The University of Chicago's is as much as $50,000, I believe, per worker. So, I don't know, and there may very well be some programming out there with the university that we don't know about. And to be fair to them, I'd be surprised if they did not have something. I'd be very surprised.
Okay, here's another one, Devin. I'm familiar with a senior housing co-op in St. Paul, Minnesota. It puts a cap on how much a unit's value can rise annually. and hence on what profit they can make when they make a sale. Is this the situation in Durham?
So I believe that what that sounds familiar to me with is a home trust model, which is different than a cooperative model. In a cooperative model, all the property is owned cooperatively, and individuals are members and pay whatever is needed to make the whole operation solvent, but they don't have anything which is theirs to sell when they live. It's much more like living in an apartment. In WCHA, we actually do have a small savings that you accrue, and when you leave, you have a portion of savings and that you get to take with you and help you with your down payment or whatever you're doing next. So as a mandatory part of what you pay each month, you pay into a savings account, which you get back when you leave, and it accrues just over time. So that's sort of just a parenthesis on the end of what I said. A home trust model, and there are trusts which are both urban and there are also rural trusts as well. And they're a similar concept. What they do is they buy land, houses or rural land, and they will then give you a lease on the property. And so what you end up is you're leasing the property, and under some circumstances you may own the actual structure. And so you may be able to sell the structure, but you don't own the land itself. And so what you're able to make a profit on is limited because of the fact that you don't own the full value of the place that you're living in. You're on a long-term lease or a split value sort of situation. It also is also used. Home trusts have the sort of secondary impact, which I would consider a benefit of having a long-term influence on how that area is developed. Because the area is long-term owned by the housing trust, it's not subject to someone coming in when there's a turnover of generations or other turnover, buying a property and putting something that is of a different character on that land. And that's both in an urban setting where it's set to provide low-income housing and someone can't develop it as non-low-income housing, or in a rural case that these sort of land trusts are used to preserve rural or environmental character of an area and prevent what the land trust considers to be incompatible development with their mission.
Thank you.
This is Tony. I was going to say, I can add on to that. There's an ongoing debate out there today, and we have to think about what problem or combination of problems we're trying to solve. If you're trying to create wealth, when we create any of these shared equity scenarios where the property appreciates, the question then is, where does that appreciation go? It can go and make the existing resident wealthier if it, again, the value accrues, or that value can be capped such that that property, when it passes on to the next household, it's passed on affordably. And so we have a number of these shared equity scenarios, whether they're in the form of a co-op or other. The whole idea is that if we're creating long-term affordability, then there's going to be some cap on the value of that property such that it is affordable to the next resident. And generally, to get in that property, you were, as the resident, a beneficiary of that same kind of generosity, some kind of grant or federal or philanthropic monies made accessing that unit affordable. Well, it's reasonable then that will continue over the life of that particular development. So I think the short answer is yes, just like the scenario in Minnesota, whether it's in a land trust or co-op or other, there are going to be scenarios where you get into the property affordably, but when you exit, it still remains affordable. There will be other scenarios, however, where that affordability condition expires after a number of years. And of course, that's a pain for all of us who want long-term to really mean long-term. No, I think really when we say long-term, some of us want it to mean stay forever affordable, but we know that that is not always the case. and we also know that we want to make families wealthier. We want to move low-income families into a point where they're beginning to accrue wealth and break out of that wealth poverty cycle. So the answer is it depends, but I would caution that if you're the beneficiary of some kind of grant or subsidy to get in, you should expect, and it's reasonable, that you pass on that same benefit when you exit.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a bit on the shared equity notion, and particularly relative to community land trusts that are doing housing, not doing land conservation. And the concept here, I would frame it a little bit different in terms of wealth creation, and that is that the community land trusts operate with this sort of limitation. It separates the property from the unit on top of it, but the resale value is calculated through a formula, and you understand this when you buy the property. And this can be the same in a limited equity co-op, for instance. You understand how much equity you're going to get returned to you when you sell your co-op unit, et cetera. These are formulaic. But I think each of them recognize the fact that the asset that increases, the equity that increases, is a function not simply of you yourself and what you did at the property. Yes, indeed, you may have improved the property and its value goes up, but much of the value in property is related to what's going on in the community. And a lot of what's going on in the community is related to public infrastructure, to economic forces that are operating in the community. So basically, the value of your property is a function of many things. And the whole concept of shared equity is to divide this equity, so to speak, between the individual and the community, so that the community essentially is retaining some of that equity, and the person who exits and sells is getting a portion of that equity as well. And I think what's really impressive about community land trust housing is that when it's compared to other government programs for first-time low-income buyers, it's extremely successful in getting those folks either stable housing for a long period of time, or then moving into market rate housing. The longitudinal studies that I've seen indicate that in most low-income first-time home buyer government programs, those folks for home ownership are back to renting, almost 50% of them, 50% back to renting within 5 years. With the community land trust model, 90% of them are still in home ownership or have moved on to market rate housing.
That's really interesting. So here's a question about the master leasing programs. You're all familiar with that term, correct? And so this writer says, master leasing programs seem like a gift to developers wanting to drive up rents. Thus, they are at the bottom of my list for achieving affordable housing. Am I wrong about this? And this is, of course, when governments or institutions lower the rent, pay subsidies to lower the rent. What do you all think about this? Anyone want to take that? An opinion about it? The former housing director of Orange County, Robert Dowling, told me once that he thought it was the best bang for the buck for affordable housing. I don't know if that's true or not, but does anyone have an opinion about the subsidies for rental housing, not housing for sale?
I mean, I have an opinion, but it's not extraordinarily well informed.
Go for it.
I think I would largely agree that it's providing guarantees to a landlord, and it does provide housing to people. So it's not a completely one-sided thing. It does provide housing, and to some extent it depends on what you're comparing it against. If you're in a city government and you have a certain amount of money and your choices are to build brand new affordable housing or to do a master lease program, you can indeed take a certain amount of money and get more affordable units by doing it that way. What it doesn't change are the other things that something like a land trust or a cooperative change, which is the nature of the housing, the nature of the ownership, the nature of the relationship to profit, the relationship to the neighborhood, and the overall improvement of the neighborhood. Those are the things that you lose.
Thank you. So here's one about a housing co-op. With a housing co-op, how do you position the co-op to acquire new properties that come on the market? Does the co-op manage a pipeline of acquisition of properties as they come on the market to bring in, or is it more sporadic? Has this changed in the last few years with the changes in the housing market? So lots of questions about housing co-ops.
I like it. I'm one of my goals is to raise the overall awareness of it as a model. I think that something that should be taken more seriously. WCHA specifically is not in a position to do a lot of acquisition. It did just purchase another single unit that was adjacent to its existing holdings in one of its Scarborough locations. So we did slowly grow as something became available, and we remain open to that, but we're in a position of still having to pay off, loans, and we're in a position of having, by definition, people who cannot afford market rates to live there to pay into the building up of capital. So we don't have an excess of capital, and that's not really our goal. Our goal is to provide cooperative ongoing housing. So where you tend to see, and I think Robert maybe put that in there right at the time when I was already answering that question, sort of simultaneously, where you do see housing cooperatives leverage their equity to help other new cooperatives form or expand is when they have paid off their loans and their longstanding cooperatives, or when they're in a situation where the property that they purchased has increased dramatically in value. And in those cases, I am aware of cooperatives which have joined together in NASCO and other associations where they make a point of trying to do not only looking for property, but they provide sort of skills training. So they will send people out and say, this is how to learn how to operate a board as a cooperative. These are some sort of trainings for the people on how to do things, which are very helpful for people who are trying to manage their own situation, save money by managing their own place, and aren't professionals. It's very helpful to have an institution like that to provide those resources.
So Fred has a question. How do you identify properties that are viable for development or redevelopment for affordable housing? How do you go about doing that?
I think that's first for George, right?
Okay, George? What do you think, George? I think you're, I'm going to unmute you.
Muted.
There you go.
Can you just repeat the question very quickly?
Sure.
Yeah.
How do you go about identifying properties that are viable for development or redevelopment for affordable housing, for the purpose of affordable housing?
Well, I mean, we've run the gamut. We started, as I mentioned at the beginning, in basically surplus city properties, a couple of old schools. We're in a part of Baltimore, just for those that aren't familiar, used to have almost 1 million people, and now we're just shy of 600,000. So there's a lot of excess inventory. So we've run the gamut. We've done adaptive reuse of school buildings. We have renovated row homes. That's a predominant architecture in Baltimore. We've built new on the campus of a former dairy that was in partnership with a local church, New Shiloh Baptist Church. So we built some new buildings there. An old Catholic high school that was sold by the archdiocese to another hospital system here in Baltimore. So, you know, identifying the viability really has to do with the opportunity. And, you know, in our part of town, everything is either going to have to be a new building or it's going to have to be a complete gut rehab. So it's really about whether or not we can make the capital stack, can assemble the capital stack, and whether the operating budget pencils out and we can cover things like debt service and things like that. So for us, it's based on where we're very place-based. So, you know, we're looking in West Baltimore, and there's a lot of need for, if, you know, you do market studies around, you know, 30, 40, and 50%, even up to 60% AMI, area median income in our part of town, the demand for affordable quality housing is almost limitless. And so we really identify, you know, the final thing I'll say is if the land is not too encumbered, you know, the thing about Baltimore is, you know, it's dense urban area, and what looks like a large acre vacant lot could be 14, 15, 18, 20 separate lots. And so land assembly can take some time. So it's a variety of things, but we're looking for where to provide the service where the need is greatest.
Hey, Peter, without giving away, or George, I'm sorry, without giving away trade secrets, how do you identify assets that you might acquire and then repurpose or develop?
How do we identify them?
Yeah.
Well, you know, because we've been at this for a few years, and one thing I just touched on, we are a faith-based organization. You know, our ministry is Sisters of Bon Secours, and we've over the years partnered with other faith-based organizations. So we've kind of got a name in town, so to speak. So, you know, if there's a church that wants to, more as often as us going out and looking on our own, someone approaches us and says, hey, you know, we'd like to do something on our campus, or hey, there's this property down the street, what do you think?
And that's consistent. I'm hearing that across the business. Your reputation is there. Once you've been in the business for a while, brokers or other practitioners will call you. But for folks who are less established, it's a little bit trickier trying to find assets.
Yeah, and let me say, for example, and thanks for the kind of the nudge there, Thurman, because, you know, on our own, it's you know, real estate can be tricky, and you know, acquisition cost can be more than just what you paid for the property. It's not just, okay, number one, you can't pay more for the property than the assessed value. And you actually want to pay less than the assessed value if you possibly can, or if possibly can. And then depending on how long you're going to have to hold the property. You know, as I mentioned, land assembly can get complicated, and you could have, you know, say 14 out of the 16 parcels acquired. And then if it's going to take it's going to take you several years, that might keep you, you know, with your holding costs and, you know, taxes, maintenance, all those kind of things. But you're looking to, you know, you're trying to develop affordable products. So, you're trying to, minimize, your acquisition costs, and you're trying to, also minimize what kind of debt service you're going to have to put on the property. So it gets a little complicated if you have a lot of equity, and whether it be equity in that your partner already owns this property, or it's equity you've gotten from outside folks, like through a LIHTC deal, that can give you some leverage. But you're trying to acquire the property and hold it for as low as a price as you can. And you're trying to not become part of the problem. So you don't want to acquire property you can't redevelop. So that's the other thing is just because it's cheap doesn't mean it's going to be viable. So there's some science to it, but there's also a lot of art to it as well, I'd have to say.
Thanks so much for sharing that. So we're going to have some questions that won't go answered, but I know some of our panelists are attempting to take those on. Thank you. But what we'd like to do is any that are not answered, we'll mail to the panelists, hoping that they'll take those on. There's one very good question I think I'd ask each of our speakers to address in closing, and it's kind of a summation question. What policy would you change, or what program would you introduce to increase the impact of your work? So
I know I was just talking, but I have one that I've been knocking at the door for several years on, which is I would like to see some reform or I'd like to see the Affordable Tax Credit Improvement Act get passed, which, you know, the allocation for low-income housing tax credits per capita has not changed since the legislation of the program was introduced in 1986. And we are in an era where affordable housing is scarcer than it's ever been, and it's a bipartisan, both sides of the aisle. Everybody is for it, but we can't seem to pass that thing. So I would say, you know, pass that legislation, decouple it from anything that, you know, that's controversial, and pass the Tax Credit Improvement Act so we can have more credits on the street.
yeah, Devin, you want to speak to that?
Okay, I'll say a couple of quick things. The first is, you know, like I said, I really want to increase the awareness of the concept of cooperative housing and how good it really works for people. And when people like policymakers are aiming to give people to move people into owner-controlled situations, they're usually thinking about single family housing when they're wanting to get people out of rental situations and into somewhere that's owner controlled. But cooperative housing is also owner controlled and does quite well by people. The second thing that I would say would be much more controversial, especially to our banker friend, and that is to decouple the idea of housing from the idea of investment. If we stand by the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's simply immoral to have people buying second homes and boats and amassing vast fortunes while other people are homeless. I think that we have a deep political problem, but it's at its root, it's a deeply moral problem that we have tied housing into the wrong part of our society.
Thank you. Thurman?
Wow. Well, you know what, but to his point, you know, there are 138 million households in this country and over 140 plus million homes, and yet we have this housing shortage. There's a distribution issue, and part of it is that you know, you have a significant part of the nation's inventory as second homes or as investor properties. That includes all those that are leased out as Airbnb and others. And then you have another third of that inventory that is not deployed fully, is either sitting vacant, blighted, or uninhabitable. And so we've got to build more. We got to build more inventory in places where people want to live, and we have to do it affordably. So I agree with the first observation. We have to expand the tax credit allocations, but that only gets to generally our households at 60% or less of AMI. We have a lot of working families that are also struggling. And so if I had my magic wand, I would have more monies available for down payment assistance so that we can make home ownership a reality for many more families.
Great. And Peter, you're the finale.
I have so many. I have to choose. One thing I do want to say is this focus on equity and democracy is really. I love the fact that Devon's here, and we've talked about community land trusts as well, because I think this combination of people being involved in the governance of their communities and the governance of their housing, it demonstrates, quite frankly, the data demonstrates that those are the folks who are have the highest security of tenure. Okay, they're the ones who are not going to get evicted during foreclosure crisis or COVID, et cetera. So it's a very interesting combination here. But I think what I would do is LIHTC, my goodness, I won't even go there. I think all the loopholes in LIHTC need to be covered. But I just second what everybody said so far and say I would look to more public money and that for the brick and mortar costs, which would reduce the debt that you needed, more public money for that, and linking that money to operating subsidies, so that it'd be a package, so to speak. That's what I would go with.
Linda, what would you like to reflect on our panel? And I just want to thank all of you. I think this has been fascinating discussion, and it's often one that's not discussed. And I really thank Linda for putting it together. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Julie. I think we need to have, as someone pointed out, a variety of types of housing so that we can get people into home ownership, whether it's a co-op or individually owned homes. When we start thinking about the homeless, if we can move them into tiny homes or some type of supportive housing with the goal of having them move into somewhere along a spectrum, a continuum of housing, maybe then into a co-op or condo, and then on to individual housing. But no matter what kind of permanently affordable housing is created, sufficient human and financial capital to make such housing financially self-sustaining is required by foundations, donors, banks, in order to obtain their contributions. And because those most in need of affordable housing often have the least financial resources, partnerships between communities and anchor institutions are essential to develop that housing, as well as partnerships with banks and financial institutions. Yet only with secure housing is it possible for people to tackle the other obstacles in their lives and begin to develop financial stability and attain financial independence. Permanent, secure housing is the first step. To our panelists, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Virginia, for your timekeeping, which actually wasn't needed, was it? All right.
Most
And
welcome.
I wish I could present you all with a chalk lapel pin for your contributions. But, just know that our thanks are heartfelt. Thank you very much. This is a great addition to the
Thank you all.
ongoing debate. Thank you.
If you're ever in Chapel Hill, the door is always open.
Hey, and Linda, if you're ever back up in Baltimore, would love to show you what we've done with the library.
Great. I
Got your
used
message,
that
yeah.
library myself growing up.
Yeah, it's really back in use. So
Mhm.
it's been a very, very good experience seeing folks, come in and start to use it again.
Great, great. Thank you all for the work that you do.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated.
Thank
Bye,
you.
right now.
Linda.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for your great questions.